I would like to say thank you very much, Claire, for coming and for agreeing to be interviewed again so I can ask you some questions about the vaccine, put questions to you that have been coming up in the Facebook group, because of course there is some misinformation. People are, they've got questions. So I'd like to thank you for taking the time. I know you've been doing your homework about this, so we really appreciate that. And obviously the sources that you've been trying to get your information from, people you've been speaking to, are all here in the UK. So I think I'd like to start by saying now at the outset that we are speaking very much from a UK perspective on this. So thank you, Claire. So Claire, why don't you begin with some basic comments that you have about the vaccine?
So I think, first of all, it's really important to say that I'm an ENT surgeon who's actively involved in research in the ENT arena, but I'm not a virologist. I'm not a specialist in infectious diseases or epidemiology. So I can certainly answer based on my interpretation of the data that's publicly available. And what I would advise really for myself, my family. I'm a mother of 2 children at school. I've got an elderly mother. I lost my father this year. And so I have all the same personal concerns and issues that we all have when thinking about how we treat ourselves and our family. And my answer will be as much from that perspective as a mum and a family member as it will be as an ENT scientist. But I have to stress that I'm not a virologist, so this is outside of my area of expertise. And there's some limitations to what's available in the public domain for me to base my answers upon.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so if I could ask the first question, that one that came up most often was, this is about, has anybody looked at people who've had the vaccine, the people that took part in these, in the first lot of research, did any of them have antibodies or indeed any kind of smell problems? Do we know anything about that?
So the way that the trial works is that it's a randomized controlled trial that takes patients who haven't been exposed to COVID and therefore are at risk of getting infection, and either gives them a placebo injection of the vaccine or the active vaccine. And the outcome that's being measured is how many people in each of those groups goes on to develop COVID. And therefore, they excluded patients who were known to have had COVID infection before recruitment. And that was really important because we suspect that there is at least some natural immunity. And therefore, they deliberately excluded patients that were known to have COVID so that there was a chance that people in both arms could go on and catch COVID if they'd been exposed to it. So the trials have specifically excluded people who are known to have COVID. But from some of the data that I've been able to find, they estimate that about 10% of people who took part, for example, in the AstraZeneca trial, likely had COVID. Now, I presume that is based on symptoms rather than none of the patients had a positive PCR test before inclusion. So they think that a significant number, there were 43,000 patients recruited in that trial, at least 4,000 were likely to have had COVID. And what you have to remember is also patients in these trials have at least 2 injections. So after the first injection, all those that received the active trial were likely already developing antibodies. So everybody having that second dose is effectively in the same boat as someone that's already had COVID and has circulating antibodies. They've already got the antibody in the system. And the way that the immune system works is that you have these memory cells, and when you're exposed to a virus or an infection for the second time, you have an even greater amplified antibody response. So people coming to be vaccinated who have had COVID and may still have circulating antibodies really are in the same position as those in the trial after the first injection coming back for their second booster. And really they'll get the benefit then of having that amplification, the boost to the immune response without having to go through the risks of having COVID again. So first of all, when you have a mild flu-like illness after having the vaccine, it's basically a low temperature, muscle ache, fatigue, a few aches and pains. It's not a mild version of the infection for which you're being vaccinated against. It's just described as being like a mild flu-like illness. So people aren't getting a mild dose of COVID, and that's really important. The other thing is, when we think about the mechanism behind COVID-related smell loss, we know that in a normal case where you catch COVID, you inhale the COVID virus particles in through the nose. They bind on in the olfactory cleft to the ACE2 receptors, and possibly another receptor called NRP1, neuropilin receptor. And they cause their damage by directly attacking and infecting the olfactory epithelium because it's got in through the nose. We think they damage first the supporting cells, and then indirectly the loss of the function of the supporting cells causes the olfactory neurons to die. When you have a vaccine, you basically get an extracted component of the virus, in most cases the spike protein. And the spike protein is a part of the virus which your immune system needs to generate these memory T cells, to generate the antibodies that will basically prep the body for a next exposure to the infection. And with a vaccine, you're only getting that component. Now that's given into a muscle, and it's not going to travel out back into the nose and get to the olfactory cleft anyway. It's the way it's being put into the system. So it'll go from where it's injected into the muscle to the draining lymphatics, the first part of the immune system, and it will cause its response in a distant site well away from the olfactory epithelium. So I think the chance of having loss of smell as a result of having the vaccine or making it worse just simply isn't real. So again, this is slightly outside of my area of expertise, but we expect that the vaccine will need to be changed. Very much like the flu jab, it needs to change each season as the virus mutates. What we've seen with the mink virus, for example, is that most of the mutations were not in the area of this spike protein. So they weren't in areas that the vaccine is targeting or utilising. And in all of the mink mutations, there was only one that affected the spike protein area. And that, if it had replicated in the community, had the potential to render the vaccine ineffective. But what they found studying that only one mutation in the spike protein was that it was present in mink in September, but it didn't translate into any community transmission. And after the cull, they haven't identified any of those mutations in patients or spreading in the community. So they've described as a sort of a dead end mutation, one that hasn't transferred or spread. Whereas the other mutations are all in the area of the spike protein, outside of the area of the spike protein, and therefore will have no effect on the response to the vaccine. I think we have to split that into two groups of people. First of all, people who have persistent smell loss on its own. And we're starting to see, and I think hopefully you can see in the posts in the group as well, good signs of continued recovery in that group, and good signs that the parosmia phase is starting to end and being replaced with a more normal functioning group. And so I completely understand that people in this group are very hesitant to consider anything that might risk a deterioration. Now, what we think is that there's olfactory sensory neuron death because of loss of these supporting cells, and we need regeneration. And in the majority of cases, we don't think that progenitor cells, which allow those to re-establish, are damaged. My worry would be for this group of patients that a second exposure to COVID infection through the normal route might cause further damage that may be even more detrimental to long-term recovery. So I would be much more worried about a second infection with COVID naturally than about the impact of the vaccine. And we're weighing up, sort of as a general principle, my decision making in would I take the vaccine or would I risk COVID? You know, there's a huge fear of the unknown with regards to the vaccine. But if we focus on what we know about COVID itself, the risk of death from contracting COVID is about 1 in 80 people. That's a significant risk. It's about 1.3, 1.4%. And people will question where those figures come from, but really that's the best data that we can get. And that data comes from, if you look at the figures in the UK at the end of June, so when we had quite good data combining from PCR tests when it was more widely available, from looking at antibody responses that we expect to be present in a reasonable number of patients up until about 3-4 months after infection. We estimated at that point in time that about 6% of the UK population had been exposed. And at that point in time, there were 44,000 deaths. So that gives you a fairly reliable death rate of 1.3, 1.4%, 1 in 80 people. That's not to mention the people that didn't die within 28 days would have been left with, you know, terrible lung failure, kidney failure, life-changing consequences of infection, as well as the people, and I don't use this term lightly at all, who have what we call a mild infection, but are left with terrible disturbances of their sense of smell and taste, which has a huge impact on their quality of life. So to risk another infection is to risk all of those things. Now, there are many unknowns about the vaccine, and I'm sure we'll talk more about the risks of adverse events from the vaccine. But, you know, it has been trialled, the AstraZeneca study, in over 22,000 patients with very few adverse effects. So you've got a 1 in 80 chance of death, or a, you know, 1 in 22,000 risk of adverse events. If you get COVID, you've got at least a 50% chance of losing your sense of smell again, versus an almost non-existent risk to your sense of smell from the vaccine. I can't imagine a mechanism where it might impair sense of smell and recovery. So we really have to weigh up what we do know compared to all of this fear of the unknowns about the vaccine. When it comes to long COVID, that is an area where there are far more unknowns. And, you know, we've seen chronic fatigue syndrome and that type of reaction to post-viral infections for many years. And we've never fully understood the mechanism behind that. So we honestly don't know what impact having the COVID vaccine may have in those patients. As I said, I would separate out the persistent loss of smell and the fluctuations in that group, because that's, I think, delayed recovery from the nerve itself. And with the long COVID group, I would put in the patients that have ongoing breathlessness, ongoing cardiac problems, severe fatigue. You hear a lot of people talking about brain fog and memory problems, and that group of patients. And it could be that a boost in the immune response to COVID might be beneficial in that population. It might have no impact. It could possibly be detrimental. I honestly can't give you the answer to that. So should patients with long COVID take the vaccine? I think the answer still isn't back. But again, we've got to weigh up all of those potential unknowns to the risk of being exposed to the virus again.
Mm.
Vaccines aren't licensed for use in pregnant women or those who are breastfeeding. So first of all, they're not going to be offered the vaccine at the moment. Now, whenever you're developing a new trial, women who are pregnant or breastfeeding are excluded from almost every trial. So every treatment that I use, be it a simple intranasal corticosteroid spray to the most complex biologic agents, have not been tested in pregnant women. And so very similarly in the vaccine trials to date, there haven't been studies published in patients who are pregnant. I think there is one trial ongoing at the moment, and there is a plan to look at the safety in pregnancy, but at the moment that's an unknown, so it's not licensed for use in pregnant women. I have no role in determining that, but in my mind, everybody should be offered the vaccine based on age, comorbidity and risk of exposure, regardless of whether they've had COVID or not before. So I don't think a prior infection with COVID should play into that. I can't wait. I have to say, I saw the COVID pods at Guy's yesterday, and I was really excited watching people going in, and I was really sad that I wasn't down there with them. I've gone to work scared for the last 9 months. You know, the first couple of months, it was horrendous. I was scared not just for myself, but I was worried about bringing COVID back and infecting my family. You know, I desperately want to see my elderly mum at Christmas, and I would love to get vaccinated tomorrow. I think it is one of the most remarkable achievements in my lifetime in medicine. And I'm really proud to be a part of it and can't wait to get it. I think one of the things I've seen come up in posts a lot is that people are very worried about, has this vaccine trial been rushed? And I saw lots of comments saying that, you know, it takes 10 years to develop a vaccine. This can't have been done properly. And I think it's really important to explain how trials work. You know, the speed with which you can develop and trial a new drug depends on many things, but depends, I think, perhaps most importantly, on the frequency of the disease or the condition you're studying in the population, the frequency of the intervention and what you're trying to change, people's willingness to take part in trials, which is almost always the biggest rate limiting step, the expertise and the availability of the trial teams, and how much money you're willing to throw at it. And it normally takes 10 years because all of those things are individually each rate limiting. I was part of a trial team looking at developing a new drug for nasal polyps. And one of the outcomes, and one of my reasons for being involved in this field, is it had a huge impact on improving sense of smell. Now, it took us 3 years to recruit 400 patients to this trial across many countries of the world, using the best recruiting centres in the world. And that was because partly the condition is relatively infrequent. To find patients willing to take part in trials was really difficult. There was a limited pot of money to throw at it. And even on the basis of those 400 patients, only 200 of which had the active component, for a drug that is going to be given lifelong and we don't yet know any long-term safety data on, this drug was approved by the FDA for use. And that shows how many patients you normally need, the length of time it normally takes to get FDA approval. If you take the AstraZeneca trial, there were 43,000 patients recruited in a period of months. That's absolutely phenomenal because patients were really willing to take part. 100,000 people signed up to the UK government website. And that's why we've been able to get this trial done so quickly. Not because it's been rushed, but because people turned up in their tens of thousands to take part in these trials. There was a huge amount of money thrown at it, and every team in the world involved in vaccine development came together and collaborated. So that's been a phenomenal achievement. None of the normal safety steps have been done any more quickly. It's just that there has been so much effort put into this that they were able to get to the end result much more quickly. Right. Now, that's not to say that it's the definitive answer. There were 43,000 patients in the AstraZeneca trial, and there were no serious adverse events within the patients that took part in the trial. So we can say that the risk of a serious adverse event is less than 1 in 20,000, but it's not going to be absolutely non-existent. And there is no treatment. There is nothing that we do in the world that is 100% safe. When we go to the shops, there's a risk that we might crash our car, we might have an accident. It's actually about 1 in 100,000 every time we step outside the front door. So nothing in life is without any risk. And we also take out insurance against that. I saw someone saying that they wouldn't take the vaccine because there's an insurance policy to cover it. But again, if we go on holiday and we take out holiday insurance, but it doesn't mean we expect the plane to crash. And we have to think of it all in perspective. Yeah. Now, there have been a couple of reports today of patients who are known to have severe life-threatening allergies who carry an EpiPen having an allergic reaction to the vaccine. And we are going to see some adverse events reported, but again, we have to think about the frequency. And when you look at vaccine trials in general, the risk of a serious adverse event to a vaccine is about 1 in 250,000. So you've got a 1 in 250,000 chance of having a non-life-threatening reversible allergic reaction to the vaccine. And again, we've got to weigh it up against that 1 in 80 chance of death and a higher risk of life-changing consequences of having COVID. So it's a scary decision, but I will not only take the vaccine for myself, but I will make sure my kids get it. I will try and push my mum to the front of the queue if I can. And, you know, all I can do is really encourage you all to try not to read the rumours and the scare stories in the papers, but really focus on what an incredible achievement this is and what an opportunity it gives us all to go about our daily lives without that constant fear of reinfection.